the sources. Can't do this printing 20 pages thing like Rotarigan does.
It's on the budget.
28 today.
That's the
29.
fundraiser.
So I sent to the mass, a little environmentally conscientious. Okay, so we're going to talk about the implications of saying Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut, both in Halacha and Hashkafa, and it's interesting to single out the question of Hallel, and specifically Hallel with a bracha, because typically if you have a holiday, so then you say Hallel, and typically if you say Hallel, you say it with a bracha. And we've kind of broken that up into three separate questions. Do we have a holiday? Should we say Hallel? Should we say it with a bracha? And we'll talk about each of those, both from a halacha, again, kind of a hashkafic perspective, and we'll try to finish off with some a clear psak halacha. So maybe the first topic to tackle, and I tried to do it separately. I wanted to do part one on Sunday and then part two today because it's really a lot. But we were returning all the books to the base. It didn't end up happening. But maybe the first thing to do is just to speak about whether Yom Ha'atzmaut in general and independence in particular is a religious value and something worth celebrating. So A, a religious value, and B, something worth celebrating. In terms of the religious value of Yom Ha'atzmaut, so you see in the sources, I think it's the first source, the Ramban clearly defines autonomy in the land of Israel, so it being a Jewish state and not just a Jewish-occupied state. I mean that in the best sense of the word, right? But as part and parcel of the mitzvah mideoraita, part of the Tariag of Yishuv Haaretz. Okay, so the mitzvah mideoraita, part of the 613 mitzvot, to settle the land, includes not leaving it in someone else's authority or domain. So our responsibility to assume sole authority over the land of Israel is part of the mitzvah mideoraita. And so you could say that is accomplished when the boundaries of Israel are unified under a Jewish government. Not that you could say that, but that seems to be a chief accomplishment. So that's number one, and maybe the most significant aspect of this, which is part of the Tariag mitzvot, according to the Ramban. Most poskim agree with the Ramban in that general assessment. This is a bit of a side point, not what we're going to talk about right now, an important point for another time in terms of whether mitzvah Yishuv Haaretz is a mitzvah mideoraita. And basically, to oversimplify things, the breakdown is the Ramban according to the Tariag, the Rambam deoraita, but not according to the Tariag. Most poskim follow one of those two. The Megillat Esther believes, based on the Rambam, that it's only a mitzvah Bizman Beit HaMikdash and Bizman Mashiach, and then Tosfot, who believes that we don't do it mipnei sakana. Basically, those are four big shitas in Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That aside, having autonomy in the land would be part of mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and therefore Yom Ha'atzmaut, a celebration of a time when we assumed autonomy, was a fulfillment of this mitzvah. But there's other significance to Atzmaut. So there are unique halacha that pertain to the land of Israel in its destroyed state. So, for example, the halacha that you should tear kriya on seeing Arei Yerushalayim, Arei Yehuda bechurbanam, so seeing the destroyed cities of Yehuda, is only applicable as long as they are not rebuilt. And how do you classify the rebuilding of the cities of Yehuda? Says the Shulchan Aruch, or really says the Beit Yosef, that's a din in Atzmaut. That's really a din in Ribonut over Eretz Yisrael. When we assume autonomy over the land of Israel, we no longer regard the cities of Yehuda as being in their destroyed state, and therefore you no longer tear kriya on them. That's another nafkamina to Atzmaut. But that's what we'll have to save questions at the end because there's just too much to get through. But try to remember the question, and we'll. Okay, so that's number two. Whether we regard this as whether we regard the cities as being in their destroyed state may depend upon our autonomy in the land. Okay, nafkamina number three is whether you can have geula shlema without autonomy. Okay, so both Rashi and the Ramban, with regard to the second geula, make this comment that as long as we don't have autonomy, the land of Israel is not, or the geula is not really considered complete. Okay, so how do we see that? Well, when we came back to Israel after the Purim story, we did so with the permission of the Persians of Daryavesh. Okay, and ultimately we lost autonomy. Right, so initially we returned to Israel with the permission of the Persians. Okay, the Persians were taken over by the Greeks. The Greeks were taken over by the Romans. Both the Ramban and Rashi make this point that up until we went back to Israel not with autonomy. We went back to Israel with permission of the Malchut that we were subject to. Right? So the first period that we were in Israel was not with autonomy. And the last period that we were in Israel was not with autonomy because the Romans ultimately took over the land of Israel and just allowed us to stay here. And so when the Nevi'im and when Chazal speak about the tkufa of our Geula, they speak about it as a very short tkufa because they take off the chunk that was prior to our autonomy when we first returned, and they take off the chunk that was post our autonomy when the Romans took us over. Even though we had the Beit HaMikdash for over 400 years, a very small percentage of that is actually Ole Lecheshbon Geula in many of the counts that we find in the Nevi'im and in Chazal. But perhaps the strongest expression, or at least the most relevant expression, is that of the Rambams. When the Rambam is explaining why we have the holiday of Hanukkah, he invokes our independence, the achievement of independence that the Maccabees brought about. Right. So when he's introducing in Hilchot Chanukah, when he's introducing the halachot, he says, "Why do we have this holiday?" Right? He says, "Well, the Maccabees fought a war, right, and they were able to return independence to the Jewish people over the land of Israel for the first time since Nebuchadnezzar." Since our initial exile in the first Beit HaMikdash. We were exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, then we went to Persia, and went to Bavel, okay? We were ruled by the Persians. The Persians let us come back. We were in Israel for between 100 to 200 years. We had a Beit HaMikdash. We had Nevi'im who told us to do that. And all of that being in place, we didn't have independence. Therefore, the Geula was not considered Shalem. And therefore, since Hanukkah was the achievement of our independence, that warranted a holiday. That's what the Rambam writes in Hilchot Hanukkah, and a clear and powerful precedent for having a holiday around the achievement of independence in the land of Israel. Okay. Any other nafkaminas we want to talk about? We'll say those are the primary nafkaminas, I think, to independence. Grounds for a holiday, no longer seeing the cities of Yerushalayim as destroyed. The Geula isn't Shalem without independence, and it's perhaps part and parcel of the mitzvah mitaryag of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That's our independence. Okay. Now, specifically, and the Rambam really constitutes a beautiful transition for this, is the grounds for a holiday around a Yom Ha'atzmaut-like event. The grounds for a holiday celebrating our return to Israel. Okay, so there are interesting sources as well as ramazim around our ultimate, what will be a celebration of the final Geula. A holiday that we will enact, that we will recognize, that we will celebrate around the final Geula. Okay? So, perhaps the clearest source is the Gemara in Brachot, which discusses the holiday we will celebrate around returning to Eretz Yisrael for the final time, basically overshadowing the holiday that we celebrate for the first time that we went back to Eretz Yisrael. What was the first time? Pesach. So the Gemara in Brachot speaks about a holiday which will ultimately celebrate around the third Geula that overshadows the holiday we celebrate around the first Geula, Pesach. However, it doesn't speak about it as being a greater miracle than the first Geula, just because of its proximity to us, its relevance in our lives more practically. It will assume kind of a central role within our religious practice and within our celebration, perhaps even more so than Pesach. That's what the Gemara in Brachot says. Now, where does that Gemara in Brachot come from? Well, it has to do with something we say on Seder night. On Seder night, we have a machloket whether or not we're going to have the mitzvah of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim la'atid lavo, which is a shocking question, right? We have a machloket. Is kol yemei chayecha, right, to include yamim veleilot? Kol yemei chayecha hayamim, kol yemei chayecha haleilot? Or is it to include olam hazeh and yimot Mashiach? But you realize that the first shita, saying it's yamim veleilot, that the Haggadah presents, must disagree with the shita of olam hazeh and yimot Mashiach. It presents it as a machloket. So what's the side to say that you wouldn't have the mitzvah of Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim in Yemot Mashiach? It seems like a crazy havamina. The Gemara in Brachot elaborates that basically the mitzvah is going to be overshadowed by our celebration of the final Geula, which is not going to be necessarily a bigger miracle, but given the proximity, it's going to be more central in our religious practice. Right? That's the Gemara in Brachot. Okay, there are other interesting ramazim that pertain to a holiday around celebrating Geula. So I'll mention one of them now, and we'll save one of them for later. So one of them now comes from the Sfat Emet, I believe, right? Who says that for the Shalosh Regalim, Mideoraita, there will one day there will be 3 regalim derabanan that parallel them. It's a beautiful idea. It says 4 Shavuot. Shavuot is Matan Torah. So what is the regel derabanan corresponding to Shavuot? That's Purim, Kimu v'Kiblu, Matan Torah, which is Kabbalat Torah Shebichtav, or Kabbalat Torah Mideoraita. Then you have Kimu v'Kiblu, Torah Sheba'al Peh in Purim. Okay? For the regel of Sukkot, what is the regel midirabanan? Chanukah. It's not just 8 days, 8 days. It's that explicitly in the Sefer HaMaccabim, it dictates that we came back to the Beit HaMikdash and we had a Chanukat HaMizbeach, and we enacted right then and there an 8-day holiday because we missed Sukkot while we were fighting. And so Chanukah was enacted Keneged Sukkot. Since we have 1 Keneged Shavuot, that's Matan Torah, Purim, 1 Keneged Sukkot, that's Chanukah, and then we're going to have 1 Keneged Pesach. What's the 1 Keneged Pesach? It's going to be a holiday around the final Geula, Keneged Pesach. So we don't have that one yet, but eventually says there will be another Chag Midirabanan to celebrate the holiday of the final Geula. So that's just a little bit of background in terms of the precedent for celebrating our final Geula and the religious significance of Yom Ha'atzmaut, the religious significance of Atzmaut in general. Okay, with that, we're going to transition to speak about the halachic sides of this, and there are a couple halachic questions. One is regarding enacting a new holiday bisman hazeh, and the second is specifically regarding saying Hallel. So in terms of enacting a new holiday bisman hazeh, you have 2 basic questions. One is Mishum Bal Tosef, and one is Mishum Batla Megillat Ta'anit. Okay, let's talk about Bal Tosef first. Bal Tosef, you're not allowed to add on to the Torah. Okay, according to Rashi and the Rambam, it's a non-starter. According to Rashi and the Rambam, the definition of Bal Tosef is adding to an existing mitzvah, not adding a new mitzvah. Okay, so the examples that they bring is if you were to put a 5th corner on tzitzit. Okay, that would be Bal Tosef. You're taking an existing mitzvah and adding on to it. However, a new mitzvah in and of itself is not Bal Tosef. As long as there's a recognition that it's midirabanan, it's totally fine. The Ramban, however, believes The Ramban, however, believes that a new mitzvah, such as a new holiday, would constitute Baal Tosef. Okay? Now let's challenge both perspectives. From the Gemara in Megillah. The Gemara in Megillah says that there was no Nevi'im had ever added on to the Torah until Mordechai enacted the holiday of Purim. That was like the first time. Then the Gemara asks, and how is he allowed to do that? How is he allowed to add on to the Torah? Says the Gemara, he made a Kal V'chomer. He made a Kal V'chomer from Pesach. Pesach was Avdut L'cheret. We were enslaved, we were then allowed to go free. Avdut L'cheret. We weren't in physical harm, but we were freed from slavery, and we had a holiday, and we said Hallel, and so Mordechai said, well, Purim, we were saved, we were going to die, and now we're alive. Kal V'chomer, we should have a holiday. And this Kal V'chomer was the grounds for the enactment of Purim. Okay, so 2 points. One for Rashi Rambam side and one for the Ramban side. According to the Ramban, Lich'ora, a new holiday, would be Baal Tosef. However, Mordechai was allowed to make this new holiday because he had a Kal V'chomer. But according to Rashi and the Rambam, why did Mordechai even need this Kal V'chomer? For them, it was not a problem in the first place. This doesn't meet the criteria for Baal Tosef. Why, according to the Gemara, would Mordechai require this Kal V'chomer? What do they say? What does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, up until Purim, no Navi added to the Torah. No Navi added to the Torah until Mordechai did it by extension of this Kal V'chomer. Says the Rambam, there's a distinct problem with Nevi'im adding to the Torah, because Nevi'im and Chachamim have a different process of being Mechadesh. Nevi'im receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay? Chachamim learn out things from Torah through a halachic process. Says there's no problem adding through a halachic analysis by Chachamim. The only problem is adding as a Navi, right? Because what's the famous din? The famous din by paskening halacha.
Nevi'im can't take away or add halacha.
Yeah, it's lo b'shamayim. Lo b'shamayim. Well, where do Nevi'im get their ideas? From Shamayim. So they can't add. So why could Mordechai do it? He used the Kal V'chomer. However, when it comes to Chachamim, there's no problem. And the Gemara only raised this issue when it came to the Nevi'im. Okay? But for the Ramban, you do have a problem. You have a problem with Baal Tosef. Nevertheless, there's a Kal V'chomer. Now, Kal V'chomer is very interesting. Why is Kal V'chomer interesting? Because the Kal V'chomer, once you argue that Kal V'chomer exists, and it was sufficient for Mordechai to use, okay, the L'chora, that doesn't go away. In fact, the Ritva explicitly says that this is the same Kal V'chomer that who uses? This is the same Kal V'chomer that Chashmonaim used to justify their holiday of Hanukkah. It had already been made by Mordechai. Come the Chashmonaim, who were not Nevi'im, and they use the Kal V'chomer of Mordechai to say, we were going to die, we can also make a new holiday. So that Kal V'chomer is a living thing. Wherever it applies, it applies. So, for the Ramban, would you have an issue, Bizman Hazeh, adding a new holiday? It depends whether you can apply this Kal V'chomer. According to Rashi and the Rambam, it seems to be a non-factor. Okay? According to the Ramban, so long as you can apply this Kal V'chomer, it's legitimate. Okay? The Chatam Sofer points out that Davka we need to use, we'll come back to the Chatam Sofer. Let's put him on the side. That's problem number one. Baal Tosef for Rashi and the Rambam is not a problem. For the Ramban, it depends if you can use this Kal V'chomer. Fine. Problem number two is Mishum Batla Megillat Ta'anit. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah deals with several holidays that they used to celebrate in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, where once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, there was a debate whether those holidays should be batel. Okay? Why is it called Megillat Ta'anit? Because those are days that you could not have a Ta'anit. Basically, it's a little bit counterintuitive in terms of the names. Okay, these are days that you cannot have a ta'anit. The main implication of the fact that it was a special day, they wouldn't say tachnun, and you couldn't have a ta'anit. Okay, now most likely the way that most paskin is that batla megillat ta'anit, and we no longer recognize these special holidays, with the exception of 2 holidays. What are the 2 holidays that that remained from the Tkufa of the second Beit HaMikdash? Purim and Chanukah. These are the only 2 that remain. Everything else was batel. However, there is a machloket, and this is a very critical machloket you need to know when it comes to Yom Ha'atzmaut. Okay, there is a machloket when it comes to Batla Megillat Ta'anit. Was that only retrospective? Meaning everything in the past that we celebrated in the Tkufa of the second Beit HaMikdash was canceled, but that's not to say we can't make new holidays. Or essentially what the Gemara Rosh Hashanah is saying is there are basically no new holidays Bisman Hazeh. It's not just that we no longer recognize Yom Nikanor from the second Beit HaMikdash, but also we cannot make new holidays. The Pri Chadash thinks, these are perhaps 2 of the most important shitas that we're going to say in the entire shir. First is the Pri Chadash. The Pri Chadash believes when we say Batla Megillat Ta'anit, that means we cannot make new holidays. Not allowed. No new holidays. Okay? It didn't just mean to erase the previous ones from the Tkufa of the second Beit HaMikdash, but it means that there are no new holidays at all. Okay? The Maharam Al-Shakir, who comes before the Pri Chadash, however, paskined that Batla Megillat Ta'anit was only retrospective. We no longer recognize the previous holidays of the Tkufa of the second Beit HaMikdash, but that does not prevent new holidays from being made. And so he paskined, relevant to his time, there were those in Germany who had this massive citywide salvation, and they wanted to set up a holiday, but they were concerned maybe this violates the principle of Batla Megillat Ta'anit. He says this does not violate the principle of Batla Megillat Ta'anit. They enacted a holiday called Purim Frankfurt, and he said not only do they have to celebrate it every single year, their kids have to celebrate it, and even if they move. So even if they no longer live in Frankfurt, their descendants should continue celebrating the salvation that they all experienced, and the idea of Batla Megillat Ta'anit does not interfere with that in any way. That's the big machloket that is perhaps most pertinent to the question of Yom Ha'atzmaut, which is, can we save questions to the end because we just have a lot of sources to get through, right? It's the machloket between the Pri Chadash and the Maharam Al-Shakar regarding Batla Megillat Ta'anit. Rav Shechter has an interesting insight. Which is that perhaps even the Pri Chadash would agree that something like Yom Ha'atzmaut would still be permissible. How does he get there? He gets there through an interesting comment of the Megillat Starim. The Megillat Starim is the Netivot's, the Nesivos commentary on Megillat Esther. Okay, Nesivos is a famous Achron, typically known for his commentary on the Gemara, but he also has a commentary on, his commentary on Chosh Mishpat, but he also has a commentary on Megillat Esther. There he asks about the permission, or there he asks about the impetus to decree a new holiday around Purim. And he says the reason they felt it important to have a new holiday, not just a Hallel, by the way, but a whole holiday, was because Purim was the Etchalta de Geula. Purim was the Etchalta de Geula. Those are the words of Megillat Starim, the Netivot on Megillat Esther. And he said that there is a special dispensation when it comes to making new holidays, that you can make a new, even if you are in Galut, you can make a new holiday around the Etchalta de Geula. Rav Shechter argues that the Megillat Starim's comment should be true for Yom Ha'atzmaut as well, even according to the Pri Chadash. Meaning whether you're the Maharam Al-Shakar or the Pri Chadash, if it's a holiday pertaining to the Etchalta de Geula, then you can make a new holiday. Now, interestingly, Rav Ovadia, who believes you should not be saying Hallel with a bracha, in that same tshuva, he basically says, even though almost all, if not all, Gedolei Yisrael saw the establishment of the state of Israel as the Etchalta de Geula, nevertheless, you shouldn't say Hallel with a bracha. So you kind of get 2 interesting pieces of information from that Rav Ovadia. First of all, is a wall-to-wall consensus, at least according to the person who perhaps knew more sources than any other human being alive, that Gdolei Yisrael thought the establishment of the state of Israel was a Chalta de Geula. That being said, no Hallel with a bracha. Okay? So, invoking Rav Shechter's comment based on the Megillat Starim, Lefi the Pri Chadash, you can argue that there's no machloket when it comes to Yom HaAtzmaut, whether you have the technical permission to enact a new holiday between the Maram al-Shakar and the Pri Chadash. Now, that being said, it kind of surprised me that Rav Shechter went through all the trouble to say that, because everyone paskins like the Maram al-Shakar. Right? The Chadam Sofer paskins like the Maram al-Shakar, the Chazon Ish paskins like the Maram al-Shakar. Really, like most notable poskim paskin like the Maram al-Shakar, that there's no problem with new holidays in theory. Okay? Now, interestingly, the Chadam Sofer, here we're going to circle back to what we were going to say earlier, which is that the Chadam Sofer had a comment, which is, but be very careful that you're using that Kal V'chomer properly. The Kal V'chomer of Mordechai, you have to be very careful to make sure you're using it properly. How so? It says, well, Mordechai looked at Yitziat Mitzrayim, and he said, Avdu l'cherut. So, Mita l'chaim Kal V'chomer. Right? He says, it needs to be a Mita l'chaim argument. It can't be an Avdut l'cherut argument. Now, the Avdut l'cherut argument would be a Binyan Av. Just like they did it, so too we can do it. They did it, we can do it. That's a Binyan Av. Kal V'chomer is, they did it all the more so we can do it. Why did the Chatam Sofer believe that you needed to make the Kal V'chomer and not the Binyan Av? Why did the Chatam Sofer believe that you could not make a Binyan Av to justify making a new holiday?
We can't make Binyan Avs.
Meaning, technically we couldn't make Kal V'chomers either.
But there already is one.
Right. And you want to say that there already is an existing Kal V'chomer, but there's not an existing Binyan Av. Interestingly, it's not how he saw it. I can hear the argument, but it's not how he saw it. He said that you cannot make, it's not the problem with making the Binyan Av, it's that it would be an incorrect Binyan Av. Because what he says is, as long as we are in Galut, you cannot argue that we've gone from Avdut l'cherut. So he thought the problem with making the Binyan Av was not a technical problem of you can't make a Binyan Av. He said that's a perfectly good svara. Maybe he believes it's implicit in Mordechai's svara. But he says, but as long as you're in Galut, you cannot make such a svara. Okay, so you davka need the Mita L'chaim argument. The Avdut L'cherut argument is not sufficient as long as we are in Galut. Now, why did Mordechai need to make the Kal V'chomer and not the Binyan Av? Because they were still subject to Achashverosh. So you couldn't make the Binyan Av, they were still subject to Achashverosh. Okay? Now, circle back around, what does that mean for a holiday where you are celebrating your Atzmaut? That the exact problem that Mordechai had when making Purim, where he needed to make the Kal V'chomer and not the Binyan Av, is not going to be a problem for us if what we are celebrating is not being subject to any other party. Meaning, the fact that the Jews were still subject to Achashverosh meant Mordechai needed to make a Kal V'chomer and not a Binyan Av because they were still in Galut. They were still subject to Achashverosh. However, if we have a celebration, Davka recognizing the fact that we are no longer subject to anyone, L'chara, you can make the Binyan Av. Okay, so that's an argument that's made by the Yaskil Avdi, one of the Achronim in the last century. Okay, that's when it comes to establishing new holidays. Let's transition. What time is it?
47.
Okay, perfect. Let's transition now to talk about Hallel. Okay, there are a number of problems raised with saying Hallel. The basic, outside of this context, the basic machloket when it comes to saying Hallel is that you can't say Hallel every day. That the moment you say Hallel on Maisim Shebechol Yom, you're not being machmir on recognizing a Kadosh Baruch Hu in the world. You are knocking down the distinction between Maisim Shebechol Yom and unique instances of salvation. So you can't say Hallel every single day. Okay? It's a weak argument against saying Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut because you can't say it every day. Okay? No one's saying that you should say it every day. We just think that something special happened. Okay? And the default is if there's grounds for a holiday, then there's grounds for Hallel. However, there are several concerns raised by the Gemara and by the Rishonim around whether every holiday warrants a Hallel. What's the precedent for this question? The Gemara in Megillah. Because the Gemara in Megillah asks on Purim whether or not Purim warrants Hallel. In fact, the Gemara in Megillah really asks it from the opposite direction. Why don't we have Hallel on Purim? Okay, one of the things mentioned was, well, it is a Nes Shebechutz Laaretz. And you shouldn't say Hallel on a Nes Shebechutz Laaretz. Do we have that problem here? We do not have that problem here. Okay? Now, L'maskana, the Gemara believes that it's not that we don't say Hallel on Purim. What's the Maskana of the Gemara there? Anyone know? The Megillah is Hallel. So is the Gemara's conclusion that Purim doesn't warrant Hallel? No, the Gemara's conclusion is that we say Hallel on Purim in the form of the Megillah. Now that's very important, because you find in the Rishonim, I think it's the Balamor, it's on the sheets, a suggestion that you don't say Hallel on holidays that were done b'derech hateva. Now, of course, the big contradiction to that shita is, what about Purim? That is the defining characteristic of Purim, that it was Hester Panim. So you could say, well, in Purim we don't have Hallel, it's not a problem. That doesn't work, because the Gemara in Megillah establishes that Meikar Adin, you were supposed to say Hallel on Purim. We just replaced that with the Megillah. It doesn't say you shouldn't say Hallel on Purim. So the Megillah is the Hallel. So Meikar Adin, you're supposed to say Hallel on Purim, and Purim is B'derech HaTeva. Now Rav Ovadia addresses that. And what he says is the Siruf Mikrim, like the series of events that led up to the Purim story, with Esther, of all people, is chosen to be in the palace, and then she was there right in time to save the Jews, and everything that needed to happen, and then he opened to the exact page with Mordechai, and Haman was there that night, and then Charvona, and then everything that needed to fall into place for that to happen. That was L'mala min hateva. That's what Rav Ovadia says. That was L'mala min hateva. So Purim is not a good Maisa Listor for that Balamor. Okay? There are two issues with that. Meaning, first of all, L'chora, that's not how we define Purim. Unless you want to say Hester Panim and Derech HaTeva are two different things. But typically we regard Purim as B'derech HaTeva, and we that's the thing. Okay? However, Rav Soloveitchik has a beautiful essay, Kol Dodi Dofek. Anyone read Kol Dodi Dofek? Kol Dodi Dofek, 6 knocks, basically, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, 6 times, basically, HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly made a call to his people to return to Israel through history. There, throughout the essay, Rav Soloveitchik, in detail, describes just how unlikely the establishment of the State of Israel was from a historical and political perspective. Okay? So, when you want to talk about a Siruf Mikrim, a series of events, of incidents that led up to something spectacular, and you're going to say that Purim is that, very hard to argue, especially for someone who read Kol Dodi Dofek, very hard to argue that Yom Ha'atzmaut does not meet the same criteria when you consider how unlikely these events were. The second issue is as follows. Rav Ovadia says you can't argue that the wars that we won in Milchemet HaAtzmaut was a nes nigla. He says even though we were the smaller army against 7 larger, more established, more advanced armies, it says that's not a nes nigla. Okay? It happens. You have one small army with a lot of rabak and a lot of motivation, and they scare away a lot of people. That happens. So according to Rav Avadia's assessment, Purim can be called a nes nigla because it was highly unlikely, but our victories in Melchamet Atzmaut cannot be called a nes nigla because this type of thing happens. The problem with that is it's against the Beferish Ramban. I've never seen someone make this argument to Rav Ovadia based on the Ramban, but the Ramban says explicitly not this way. When the Ramban is actually talking about the final redemption, and he classifies, and this Ramban is on the sheet, and he explains why it's going to be such a clear and open miracle, he says that the small army of the Jewish people will succeed in being rodef many, many larger armies than itself, and that is a nes nigla that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence will be seen throughout the entire world. It's a beferish Ramban. That should be classified as a nes nigla. Okay? So that's what I would suggest back to Rav Avadia, though I've never seen someone make that argument explicitly inside. Okay? Other issues brought up in terms of other issues brought up with saying Hallel on this day is it wasn't done for all of Klal Yisrael. It wasn't done for all of Klal Yisrael. Okay, it was done. It was very, very helpful for the Jews in Israel, obviously, but most of Klal Yisrael was not in Israel. Most of Klal Yisrael was fine beforehand and fine afterward. Okay, now there's an interesting Maisa Listar by Hanukkah. Okay, where were most of the Jews in Hanukkah? Not in Israel. Like 95% of them weren't in Israel. Nevertheless, we say Hallel for 8 days on Hanukkah. So the Rokeach believes that is unique because Hanukkah pertained to the reconquering of the Beit HaMikdash. So even if there wasn't salvation for all the Jews, the Beit HaMikdash is significant for all Jews. Okay, so either you could say Hanukkah is just a total Maisa Listor to this topic, or you can say Hanukkah is not a Maisa Listor Lagamri because the Beit HaMikdash was significant for all Jews even if it didn't save the lives of all Jews. And the question is whether you would regard Medinat Yisrael as the same. Something of significance for all Jews, and certainly if not Medinat Yisrael, certainly by Yom Yerushalayim, right? For reconquering Yerushalayim, even if you could say this was not a salvation for all Jews, this was significant for all Jews. Okay. The final issue that we'll talk about, and in my eyes, this might be the strongest argument, is I get that there's grounds for a new holiday, and I get that there's grounds to say Hallel, but the day that you chose is not that day. Why? Because if you have to argue that there is a kal v'chomer here, avdut l'cheiru mita l'chayim, and that, according to the Ramban, is a prerequisite for making a new holiday bisman hazeh. Okay? That, according to the Ramban, is the prerequisite. You need that kal v'chomer. Okay? Then, when were we in more danger? Dalet ER or Hey ER? Hey ER, we were in much more danger than we were in the days, months, and years leading up. That's when all the enemy nations decreed war against us for establishing the state of Israel. So, granted, maybe you can have a holiday around the final Geula. Granted, maybe you can have a holiday around Independence. Granted, maybe you should be saying Hallel. Okay? However, on this day we were in more jeopardy, so this would be a much harder argument to make Mordechai's Kal V'chomer. We should wait until the war is over and then celebrate then. Okay? So the day that we chose is in question. So let's not say, hey, Iyar is special, even if everything we said up until now is true. Okay? But there's one problem with that, and it comes from the Khatam Sofer. According to the Khatam Sofer, we don't need to use the Kal V'chomer. Why do we need to use the Kal V'chomer? Because if this is Itchalta de Geula, then we no longer are subject to the restrictions of Galut. We're subject to the restrictions of Galut, then we need the Kal V'chomer. That's why Mordechai made a Kal V'chomer. He was still subject to Achashverosh. Okay? However, you don't need to make the Kal V'chomer if we're no longer in Galut. Then you can just make a holiday and say Hallel based on the grounds that we're no longer in Galut. And if that's the case, what day should you do that on? The day that you are no longer in Galut. The day that you achieved independence. If Mordechai could not make that argument because they were still subject to Achashverosh, what is the first time in history, at least since the Chashmonaim, that we could make that argument? That would be Hei Be'ir Tashach. Okay, so that's a new holiday, and that's grounds for saying Hallel. A specific question comes up when it comes to Hallel, saying Hallel with a bracha. Then they're like, well, it's still Shanui b'machloket, so we shouldn't say a bracha. Okay. It seems like there's this unwillingness to just go all the way and make the psak. The Rabbanuta Rishit paskins you should say with the bracha. Rav Malam and Rav Rimon paskins you should say with the bracha. That's who I personally follow. I know there are those legitimate poskim who are Zionists who say not to say Hallel with the bracha. Rav Avadia thought you shouldn't say Hallel with the bracha because because it's not Geula Shlema. We still have a ways to go. And there's a klal that when you suffik bracha lahakel, even if it's one shita against 99, you shouldn't make the bracha. It's an interesting klal because we seem to never follow it. Meaning, there's a machloket whether women should say mitzvot on brachas a mitzvot asher says Javan grama. Does anyone say that they should not make that bracha? Yes, the Shulchan Aruch. What do Ashkenazim do? We make that bracha. Why? We paskin like the Ramah. Oh, but there's one shita, the shita of the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so you have to be very careful with your application of this principle if there's any shita that says not to make the bracha. Okay? Every single bracha that you make, there's a shita that says don't say it. Okay, so we need to be careful with that. And then number two, the geula isn't shlema. I hear it. The geula is not shlema. I'm the last one to argue the geula is shlema. However, you know when the geula wasn't shalem? Pesach. We were in the Midbar. We weren't even in Israel. You know how long it took us to get a Beit HaMikdash after Yetziat Mitzrayim? Over 400 years. You know when else the geula wasn't shlema? Purim. We were still in Galut. We didn't have a Beit HaMikdash. We didn't have independence for another 200 years. Okay? It seems like we make holidays and we say Hallel with a bracha on Etchalta de Geula. That's the point the Megillat Starim made. So to say that you should say Hallel but without a bracha because the Geula isn't Shalem, every other holiday we have on Geula that isn't Shalem, we say Hallel with a bracha. Or at least acknowledge that we should. And so it's a strange argument here. Lemaisa, a new holiday, seems perfectly that there is grounds for a new holiday. Hallel seems that there is grounds for Hallel. It is still a contemporary debate whether you should be saying a bracha. I hear the argument not to say it. I'm much more in favor of the argument to say it. Okay, I need to clear the room for Rav Lichton, but I'm happy to take questions afterward.